Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm Robbie Rhino, and in today's video I'm going to be featuring the BMP-3, which is one of my favourite tanks in the Cold War game mode. I've already had a couple of videos on the channel of this tank, but I wanted to do another one because I've had some pretty damn good games in this tank, and I wanted to focus purely on the firepower of this tank and just how devastating it can be when you let this tank do its thing on the battlefield, get around with its excellent concealment and mobility and wreak havoc. And it doesn't take much time at all to deal a lot of damage in this tank because of the insane damage potential with the DPM of the 30mm cannon and the ATGM launcher. You can use the multiple weapon system with this tank, which means that you can switch between both of the weapons with no time penalty, and it has a staggering combined damage per minute, which we'll discuss in just a little bit. But I'm going to start off this video by giving a brief rundown for everyone of the stats of the BMP-3. I'm going to tell you my commander and equipment setup should you wish to set up the BMP-3, as I have done in the 3 gameplays in this video that hopefully demonstrate just how powerful this tank can be. So what is the BMP-3? Well, it's an Era 3 Eastern Alliance light tank, and when you get it you have 3,000 hit points, which is more than enough to take a few shots. You have 550 meters view range, and that's more than adequate because you have a 0.43 steel concealment, which means you can get forward very easily undetected, use that view range to spot out your enemies should you wish to play that typical scouting role. Your mobility is absolutely exceptional. You have a 35.21 power to weight ratio. You can go forwards at 82 km an hour, backwards at 24 km an hour, and your traverse speeds on your hull and turret is 46 degrees a second. So it's very nimble at circling some of the slower tanks in Era 3 of Cold War, and also getting around the battlefield and evading fire and pushing the tempo of the battle. In terms of the firepower then of the BMP-3, as I have alluded to, you have a 30mm cannon which has 200 shots per clip and 600 shots in total, and you have an ATGM launcher. And like I've already said as well, you can use the multiple weapon system, which means that you can switch between your primary 30mm gun and your ATGM launcher with no time penalty, and that gives you a staggering damage per minute, and I'll tell you the figures in just a little bit. But in terms of the 30mm cannon, you fire 200 shots per clip and you have 600 shots in total, so you can fire 3 whole magazines worth of 30mm rounds. If you do manage to penetrate every single round with your 30mm cannon, you would deal 3,000 damage, as it's 15 alpha damage per round if you are firing APDS, which is your standard round, or APF SDS, which is your premium round. You'll get a little bit more damage if you fire the HE rounds, which are for 25 alpha damage, but that would mean that you would have to use 40mm of penetration on the HE rounds, which is near enough impossible to use in Era 3 of the Cold War game mode. So I fire pretty much all APF SDS run in every game that I come into with the BMP-3, and that's because the penetration on this gun is absolutely shocking. It's 105mm on your standard APDS rounds and 167mm on your premium APF SDS rounds. These rounds are only going to work up close and personal when you're at the sides and rear of the enemy, not firing at composite or spaced armor, and you're not firing through tracks, and you're finishing off lightly armored tanks. But your main sort of cannon obviously is your ATGM. So in terms of these 30mm rounds, the shell velocity on your standard rounds and your APDS rounds is 1,120 meters a second, which is pretty good. Even better on the premium APF SDS rounds at 1,310 meters a second, meaning that it's better for leading targets at mid to long ranges, 960 meters a second on your HE rounds, and your DPM of the 30mm cannon is 4,633. In terms of your ATGM launcher, you can fire 14 ATGMs per battle. They have a damage of 980 with 850mm of penetration, which is very, very nice indeed. That's enough penetration to go through many tanks you're going to come across in Era 3 of the Cold War game mode. And you can also fire HE rounds out of this ATGM launcher, which have 120mm of penetration for 470 damage. And that's it for the first gameplay. We'll continue the little breakdown in the second replay. We finished that game with 7,036 direct damage. We have 2 kills, 1,056 assistance. We finish in the MVP slot on our team, make a nice profit of over 100,000 silver. And that's a pretty good first game to show you that in 4 minutes and 24 seconds we dealt a combined damage total of 8,000 or more than 8,000 damage, and that's just to start things off, and the replays do get a lot better as we go on. So we're going to head on now into the second replay. I'll finish talking about the ATGMs and then we'll get talking about my commander and equipment setup and the gameplay in the background. So then, we're now into the second gameplay of today's video. We're here on Nomonhan in the BMP-3. I'm going to start by finishing off talking about the ATGM launcher on the BMP-3, and then we will get talking about my commander and equipment setup and the gameplay itself, and talk a little bit about how insane the firepower potential of this tank is. So the ATGM launcher, as I have said in the first gameplay in today's video, you have 14 ATGMs per battle and you have 48 of the HE rounds with this ATGM launcher. You have 980 alpha damage for 850mm of penetration with your ATGMs, which is very nice penetration for an ATGM in the Era 3 of the Cold War game mode. And in terms of your HE rounds, it's 470 alpha damage if you penetrate 120mm of penetration. In terms of the shell velocity on your ATGM, it's 370 meters a second, and on those HE rounds with this launcher it's 355 meters a second, so pretty standard for an ATGM. And the DPM of this ATGM launcher is 4,900. So when you combine the DPM of your 30mm cannon and your ATGM launcher, and remember you can switch between both of these with no time penalty with the multiple weapon system, your combined DPM is 9,533, which absolutely eclipse any of the heavy tanks or any of the other tanks that aren't tanks that can use the multiple weapon system in the Cold War game mode in Era 3. So in terms of my commander and equipment setup then, what do I run on the BMP-3? Well, in terms of my equipment, I run advanced concealment, traction system and advanced powertrain, and with my commander I run Sixth Sense, Born Leader, Rapid Loading, Steady Aim, Rapid Aim, Snapshot, Run and Gun, Camouflage Expertise and Muffled Shot. In terms of my equipment, I run the advanced concealment because this thing has such good concealment anyway. I do want to boost that up as much as possible because I want to make use of the foliage, the shadowy areas, and get around the battle as undetected as possible so I can ambush the enemy. And in terms of the other two pieces of equipment, I run the traction system and the advanced powertrain because I feel like the commander skills boost my DPM up, they boost my gun handling and everything like that up to a point where I want to improve my mobility even more to make myself the most feared light tank in the game. In terms of my commander skills, you could consider running Green Thumb instead of maybe one of the gun handling skills to improve your concealment even more, but this is a pretty good setup that I use. I use this commander on a couple of other light tanks, so I do keep it the same, and I found that this works very well for me. But yeah, experiment if you wish, and I'm sure it will be good. So when you have my commander and equipment set up exactly as I have just stated, you would get a view range of 573 meters. Your still concealment rating would be 158 meters, which means that you are exceptionally well concealed and you can get around the battlefield very sneakily indeed, and you're pretty much only spotted with the true vision system if you're skylining yourself on a ridge, or you're spotted once you fire. Your mobility would improve. You would now have a 36.8 power to weight ratio. You would have a forwards top speed of just shy of 95 kilometers an hour, a backwards speed of just shy of 28 kilometers an hour. Your traverse on your hull would be 52.8 degrees a second, and on your turret it would be 55.07 degrees a second. In terms of the DPMs of both of my different weapons, on the 30mm cannon the DPMs jumped up to 4,785, and with the ATGM launcher the DPM has jumped up to 5,674, which means that with my commander and equipment setup added to the raw stats of the BMP-3, I now have a combined DPM of 10,459 with both of my different weapons using the multiple weapon system, and that is absolutely crazy. And I'm hoping that you've already seen, as I've been waffling on in the first 5 minutes of this battle, how much damage you can do in a short space of time. If people come at you and you have both of your different weapons loaded, and you make sure that you penetrate your ATGMs in as many of your 30mm rounds as possible, you will be dealing a hell of a lot of damage. So in the first 5 minutes of this battle, or under 5 minutes, we've dealt 8.6k direct damage and 4.6k assistance. In terms of playstyle with the BMP-3, as you can see from the gameplay in the background, I like to play quite aggressive, playing that scouting role to start off the battle, get some good assistance, maybe catch out another light tank or a faster heavy tank with an ATGM, and I have the ability to get out of harm's way if possible. I try and make sure that I'm not surrounded at any point, and I just make use of this firepower. I use the ability to juke where I'm going. If I'm going one way and they're looking at a corner I might come from, I swing round and go the other way, and I'm trying to get to the sides and rears of these heavy tanks to make sure I penetrate these ATGMs. Of course, you do have to be careful with the ATGMs against things like that Macabre Mark III and other tanks that have a lot of the composite explosive reactive armour that protects you from the ATGMs. You want to fire at the weak points, which are the engine decks, the rears of most tanks, turret wings, cupolas, and just avoid all of the spaced armour and the tracks. And when you're using this 30mm cannon, I feel like you can just circle tanks and shoot them in the sides, and quite a few times you will penetrate. And if you have the time to aim, obviously go for weak spots because the penetration is pretty bad. But I've just about managed to get everything in there in that very quick paced game once again, where we have an ace tanker. We're now on 89.43% marks of excellence. We have a 1700 or above 1700 base experience points, a nice profit of 151,000 silver, 9.3k direct damage, and 5,012 assistance damage, finishing in the MVP slot, and another brilliant game in 5 minutes and 43 seconds. And I think you're seeing a trend of how much damage this tank can do if you let it do the damage it can do in a very short space of time. So that's it for the second gameplay. We're going to jump over now into the third and final gameplay, where we're going to do even more direct damage. Righty ho then, we're into the third and final replay of today's video. We're once again on Nomonhan in the BMP-3. This time we've spawned in the southwestern corner, and we are going to use the same kind of tactics that we used in the last replay. So we're going to make use of our mobility early doors to try and get some spots off towards the north of this map, see where the enemy are coming in from. We're going to hopefully get some early ATGMs into some tanks that have pushed too far forwards and try and ambush them. Then we might retreat a little bit and pick off our targets one by one. The reloads for the ATGMs and for reloading the magazine of the 200 shots for the 30mm cannon is absolutely insane. With my commander and equipment set up, I now reload the 30mm auto cannon in 7.77 seconds, and in terms of my ATGM launcher, I now load one ATGM in 10.35 seconds, and you can see just how quickly you can reload. You've already fired, got back, re-stealthed, and you're reloaded again. And people think that this thing fires its ATGMs, they come after you, and they don't realise by the time they've got to you, you've reloaded again, and you have the multiple weapon system. You can switch between two different weapons and absolutely annihilate them, and it is quite hilarious when you annoy other tanks and they come after you, you bait them into stupidity, you get all the assistance for them chasing you, and then you can finish them off once they are isolated. And this tank is fantastic for isolating other tanks, but as the thumbnail suggests in this video, it's also fantastic for when another tank has anchored you. Maybe they've chased you, they've hounded you all game, they've got some early shots into you, and you're waiting for your moment, you're biding your time, and you can unleash fury on them once you've picked your right moment. And it's all about picking that right moment with this tank. You can do what I'm doing now, where I'm sat up here in F3 on Nomonhan. I'm just sniping with the ATGMs, trying to get shots into tanks in the distance. I'm hopefully as sort of invisible as possible behind this foliage. I'm a smaller profile light tank, and I can drop down behind this ridgeline as possible, but I'm trying to get ATGMs in at sort of mid to long ranges, and of course you can do that with this tank. It's harder to hit the ATGMs than any other shell, obviously, in the Cold War game mode, because they have such a slow shell velocity, but it's rewarding when you do, and you do get used to handling them after a little while. But this thing really does excel when you get up close and personal and you're circling a tank. Make sure when you're aiming your ATGMs and you're circling, you're free aiming into the weak parts of the tank, sides and rear, like I said in the last replay. You're going for engine decks and weak points, but also if a tank like a Soviet heavy tank that we're coming up against now in the form of the T-72 BM comes, you can aim for drive wheels of tanks if you can't find a weak spot beyond all of the spaced armour and the sort of composite explosive reactive armour. You can go for drive rails and often penetrate with your ATGMs, and that's a fantastic place to shoot, because a lot of the time you will damage their engine, you'll set tanks on fire, and with ATGMs you will have a lot of fires given to your enemy. You'll have a lot of ammo racks, and it's just a hell of a lot of fun. But in terms of the multiple weapon system, one of the reasons as we talked about ammo racks, we have a very nice one there on a Type 85-2M who's gone back to the garage. But in terms of the multiple weapon system, I wanted to do another video on this tank because I wanted everyone's opinions. Do you think this is overpowered? Do you think this is too good? The stats for the marks of excellence, so how much damage you have to do, the requirements for sort of the marks of excellence in this tank are very low compared to a lot of tanks, and that's the same for quite a lot of the light tanks. And I'm guessing it's because obviously they're lightly armoured, you've got good mobility, and players that don't have a lot of experience, that go around the maps, that don't know their maps too well, will get themselves in a situation that they can't get out of, and they'll get taken out very quickly. And yeah, that's probably the reason why. But in an experienced player's hands, there are sometimes nothing that you can do, even if you yourself are a good player. When a player in a tank like this, which has this damage potential, comes after you, it's just game over unless they get unlucky and have an ATGM absorbed, or they're not loaded, that kind of thing. So it's just it's one of those things, I guess. It's a bit give and take with things like this. You're going to have those players that are going to be able to abuse the firepower, and then you're going to have players that will get themselves killed very quickly, and it balances out to make the tank look mediocre or not that good in terms of the stats, in terms of the marks of excellence stats anyway. But I think it's extremely powerful. I'm not sure I myself would say it's overpowered, purely because I like this tank and I don't want it to be nerfed, but the multiple weapon system gave this tank such a substantial buff compared to what it used to be. And now it's a lot of people's favourites, but also a lot of people just don't play it in this kind of way where they're getting forward, they're making use of the firepower, they're trying to play too much of a sniping game with this tank and playing it more like a tank destroyer. Whereas this thing can do very, very well up close and personal. You can kind of brawl with heavies in the sense that once they fired a couple of shells, you can usually absolutely wreck them, unless you try and get away by running into a dead wreck. Fortunately, we've conserved enough hit points at the start of the game to keep them in this particular replay here on Nomenhan, and we're now down by 2 tanks, and we're going to just try and relocate and maybe come round from a different flanking position. Unfortunately, we're still 2 tanks behind. There's only 3 tanks left on our team, me being one of them, and I'm hopefully going to help out my heavy tanks in the centre of this map by distracting this M1A2. We get a nice ATGM into the side, we track him in place, and we're just trying to do as much possible to these tanks whilst our enemies are fighting it out in the middle. Our friendlies are fighting it out in the middle, I should say. It's not looking too good for this game because there are a lot of hit points on the enemy team still left, so we're going to have to try and do as much work as possible to try and take out these tanks. We managed to run rings around this M1A2 who's come down looking for us. We're going to fire an ATGM on the move. We free aim it, but we unfortunately just hit the corner of the track and it's not penetrated, and now we have to switch to our 30mm cannon and go to town on the sides and rear of the M1A2. We switch to our ATGM, set him on fire with a shot in the side, and that's him dealt with. And now it's 3 on 3, and I was thinking more positively at this point that we're definitely going to take this one down, but there is a Challenger 1 on a lot of hit points, and there is a Leopard 1A5 still in the game and an M1A2, so I'm going to have to try and get around the sides of one of these tanks and take this game down with the help of my heavy tanks on this team. So I've switched to my 30mm cannon from distance. At this distance you should be able to go through some of the time against the sides of like an M1A2, but you would struggle against a Soviet heavy. And now we're going to come up behind this Challenger 2, get an ATGM right into the back drive wheel of the Challenger, and we set him on fire, and now we're going to escape. And we've already picked up 10.6k direct damage and 2.5k assistance. Our MBT-70 on our team helps to take another tank down, and then it's 2 against 2, so this is a very exciting game, and these are the kind of games that get your heart racing. It's very unusual for a Cold War game to last a full sort of 15 minutes, but it was nice to see a game that lasted longer than the typical all-in, one flank, everyone goes the same way and rushes tanks and annihilates them, and it's over very, very quickly. But we come up against this Challenger 1. We managed to finish that Challenger 1 off with a well-aimed ATGM. We have 1 ATGM left. That's one of the things about this crazy DPM, is that you can run out of ATGMs very quickly in the BMP-3, so you do have to try and make them count as much as possible, because they are so effective and they reload so quickly, and it can help your team out no end. But that M1A2 has fired his shell. He'll be reloaded by now, but we come over, we have our last ATGM, and we get it right into the side of that M1A2 and take that one down for our team. And I was shaking a little bit at that point. It's not very often after so many years of playing this game that you feel that adrenaline and that shake, but this was one of them. So we finish in the MVP slot in that game with a 225,000 silver profit, 5 kills, the mastery badge. I'm not sure whether this was played before the last game because my marks of excellence are now 1 star again, but 11.6k direct damage, 2.5k assistance, those 5 kills, and an absolutely insane game, which was a lot of fun. But I hoped that this video has demonstrated the power of this tank and just how dangerous it is. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're all having a great weekend, and until next time, I'll see you on the battlefield, and bye for now.